and you're all very welcome to today's Client Experience Programme webinar on how to be an effective and trusted leader. As you know, our Client Experience Programme is all about bringing you practical insights on some of the biggest opportunities and challenges facing in-house legal teams. And today's session, we're going to take on the big topic of leadership. Given the evolving role and influence of in-house legal teams, I think it's really fitting that the first session of 2024 and one of our most popular on the current series is today's session. I'm sure you're all starting into the delivery of ambitious plans for the year ahead, and all of these plans involve people. As always, we'd really encourage you to get involved in today's discussion. Pop any questions you have, your perspectives as we move through the content of today into the chat. We'd love to get your views and opinions on the session as we move through. I'm very excited to introduce you to our hosts of today's session, Dan Kane and Alan Booth. I am going to start with Dan, who's back by popular demand after a lovely session with us last October. So Dan, over to you.
Niamh, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see everyone. Thank you for having me back. As you said, Dan Kane, founder of O-Shaped. O-Shaped is an organization that's leading cultural change across the legal industry in the UK and more broadly, very much with people front and centre, and leadership forms a huge part of that. Formerly a general counsel, practiced in private practice for several years, in-house for about 15 years, the last 7 of which as a general counsel, where I learned loads about leadership and learned loads about what was good and what was bad and what I got right and wrong. And hopefully I can share some of that with you guys today. So thanks for having me. Alan, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you happen to be. I'm just delighted to be working with Dan today. My name is Alan Booth. I am an executive coach. My work goes primarily to C-suite level in larger organizations in a corporate setting. I also do a fair amount of work with professional services firms, including law firms and, in fact, including dentists. By way of legal background, I actually started my career in labor law in a group that managed all employment-related litigation and challenges in one of the major global banks. The reason I mentioned that is it was there that I first found out and realized the connection between performance, quality, and leadership. And of course, those of you, there are many on the call who are in general counsel operations, you spend a fair amount of time trying to keep your organization out of trouble. And I was amazed at the number of times we kept getting into the same trouble, largely because people didn't get leadership quite right. So I think this is a fabulous topic to begin your year with. And Dan, I'm looking very much forward to exploring it with you. Now, we have an agenda. Perhaps we should take the group through what we intend to cover.
Yeah, so all being well, it's fairly self-explanatory. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about purpose, its role in leadership. Moving on to influencing and building fellowship, Alan will take us through that. We'll look at lawyers as leaders, and in particular how the legal industry has developed leadership roles. And then we'll look at the trust equation as part of how Alan will talk us through relationship with stakeholders and the role of how in-house are leading change within their organizations. And that will help us look at how do we take our in-house teams forward to what is an ever-changing environment to lead in. So hopefully that gives you a good flavor. Before we kick off, it's great to hear a bit more about what you think and see. And so, Alan, over to you just to share a question and a poll we have for everyone on the call.
All right. Well, it's actually part of leadership to find your stakeholders where they are, and let's do that now. So use the chat feature on this one. We'll take a look and see what you put in there, but you can see the question on the screen. What we'd like to know is your own experience. So what words, we've asked for top 3, but whatever you can share will work. What words would describe the best leader you've worked with? What's that experience like? There we go. Open, approachable. There's the empathy word, Dan.
Yeah. And the authentic word comes up a lot, and it'd be good to explore authentic. It's interesting, just as people are coming up, one of the things that people used to say to me in terms of what authenticity means when it comes to leadership is that there are different levels of authenticity. And I used to try and kind of think that's a bit like being half pregnant, isn't it? Really, I think you should be either authentic or not. And if you're not, then the question mark arises to how trustworthy you are if some people don't consider you authentic. But we'll look at that and explore it. I think it's a key thing that comes through. Has my back,
And
supportive, another thing very common.
empathy shows up a lot. In the words I'm noticing, authentic is showing up. Empathy, discipline, a really interesting word. Honest and understanding. And yeah, so we're getting them over and over again. All right. Well, Dan, that's one side of the coin. Maybe we should ask them about the other side.
Yeah, and you'll see, look, it may well be it's the opposite, but it'd be great to hear some of your experience of the kind of characteristics where you've seen the opposite, the worst leadership traits that you've seen. This all helps us to frame the discussion, I think, for the rest of the session.
So here's your chance. Here we go. Micromanagement. Selfish, disengaged.
Yeah.
Demanding with an explanation. Oh, that's interesting.
Micromanagement. Yeah, so go on. Sorry, Alan, you were just saying.
I was saying demanding without explanation.
Yeah, okay.
Ego-driven. Arrogant shows up a lot.
Yeah,
we're getting, again, micromanagement, inconsistent, indecisive. Yeah. Oh, entitled. I like that. Yeah, again, insecurity, arrogance, bullying, not
lots of great
back.
stuff through.
Yeah. Okay, we're getting a couple of themes here. And I particularly like this, doing it without, it's all about them. It strikes me that leadership, when it's weak, doesn't have much focus. That's one of the themes I'm seeing coming out here. And we saw consistency coming out and, understanding in the stronger ones. Seems to me that points us toward one of the main concepts on leadership we were going to talk about today, Dan.
Well, yeah, it'd be useful to start with purpose. Look, you can take leadership conversations in so many different directions. And for us to try and share our thoughts on what that means over the next hour or so, others will have a very different perspective where to start with this. What we do know are some of the words that you've described are things that we'll hear regularly when it comes to how people consider the role of leaders. And I hope that what we'll share with you between us will cover what good looks like, and also by dint of doing that, you'll see a little bit more about some of the poorer behaviors. But I want to start with purpose and talk about why purpose becomes such a big thing when it comes to the role of leadership. Over the last few years, certainly since Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, wrote a very famous letter now to the CEOs. He writes one every year. This was back 2019 to the CEOs of companies he invests in. He talked about purpose and profit, the importance of stakeholder as much as shareholder profit. And from then on, there's been a real sense of the importance for organizations to think about their role in wider society. And that means those who are leading those organizations need to embody what it means to be a purpose-led organization, and therefore leaders within that organization. And there's no doubt you see those people who genuinely believe that their role is about driving their organization forward in a purpose-led way. Though coming with that, of course, and this authenticity will come up, because if we consider that the purpose acts as the North Star for an organization, that it's the direction of travel that leaders have been able to embody, then it's something that means we can make decisions regularly in complex environments that are consistent with that purpose. And if we are true to that purpose, in some respects, it makes decision making much easier. And for leaders, actually, in some respects, it's a bit of a cheat sheet, I suppose. Because if you're true and honest to the purpose that's been set, then frankly, it should help guide every decision you make. But that requires, I think, from an organizational perspective, this regular and authentic communication. So it's not take long for authenticity to come through. Now, Larry Fink continues to write every year and continues to focus on purpose in those conversations with the CEOs of the companies he invests in. Back in 2022, he talked about companies' purpose being the foundation of the relationships with stakeholders. and critical to long-term success. But importantly, also said employees need to understand and connect with your purpose. And when they do, they can be your staunchest advocates. And so this connectivity for me is at the heart of what leadership is about. Connecting what it means to lead teams with what the people in those teams understand, and making sure that you are the link between the organization and the employees. And that's why I've highlighted there the other element of purpose, which is from Daniel Pink's work, Autonomy, Mastery, Purpose. We can talk a bit more about autonomy and mastery, but I wanted to focus just on the individual purpose here, about the leader's role in ensuring that people in the teams have a sense of meaning and purpose in the work that they do. And I'm sure that within the teams that you are involved in or lead, for those of you watching and listening in, you'll see the difference between those people who are completely attached to and understand the meaning and purpose of their work, compared to those who are much more disengaged and don't necessarily see or sense that meaning within their work. And so for me, this role of leaders to bring people along with them in the sense of not only their organizational purpose, but giving people a sense of purpose and meaning in their work, are dual responsibilities of a leader. And I think it's summed up nicely for me in the quote that, and I like this quote, I use it a lot. It's from J.W. Marriott, famously of Marriott Hotels. And for me, this sums up what I like to think O-Shaped is trying to do across the legal industry. And that's all about investing in and taking good care of your people or your employees, who will in turn take good care of your customers, and your customers will continue to come back. And for me, that's quite a neat way of summing up what I think is purpose-led leadership. Alan, what's your take on that?
I really like this quote, Dan, because the purpose is in behind it. You can see it implied. But what I really like about it is it points to purpose and how that gets put into action. And when I read Marriott's quote here, it makes me think that the purpose has translated into specific promises that are getting made to stakeholders, right? So if you read that statement, the implicit promise that I see is, I promise we'll take care of you. And the promise to the customers is, I'll take care of you. And, it reminded me of some work I was doing with one of my clients as a CEO. He's a lawyer himself, but finds himself CEO of a smaller regional bank in the United States. And he was doing a lot of work around purpose, and we were doing some work together. And he was at his wit's end with his CFO because he was turning down every budget request that came in. And people were coming and complaining, and he kind of had to override and undo half of the declines. And so I said, well, what's the issue with that? And he said, well, if he understood our purpose, he would know what to say yes to. And so he did some more work, and he defined it into these promises that are made to stakeholders. And when he made that clear, and he asked just one question, then he said to his CFO, look, when you get this stuff in, ask one question. Does this go to keeping one of the promises we've made that relate to our purpose, promises to our investors, to our board, to our clients, to our people? And immediately his workload was cut in half, because all of a sudden the context was there. So what I like about this quote, and I love that we've started with this question of purpose-led leadership, is that leadership requires context, and it implies direction and movement toward some useful and valuable outcome. And when you've got that clear in your mind, leader's role becomes much easier, because what you are doing, if you look at Pink's last square there, when you think about it that way, purpose actually comes first, then follows autonomy and mastery, because you have moved from worrying about what people do to focusing on how they think. If they think in alignment with the purpose and the direction you as a leader are setting, they will know more readily what to do, and therefore performance will rise, and your stakeholders are more likely to be happy. And that goes right back to one of the words that came out when we asked our first question, Dan. What did people like? Consistency. And inconsistency came out in what was the worst they'd ever seen. Well, where does consistency come from? It comes from an understanding of the direction you want to take, and sticking to that, and continually asking for it, communicating it often. So, we've sort of dwelt on this point, but I don't think we can underestimate the importance of having a clear sense of purpose and direction for a leader, because otherwise, how will you lead?
But one of the things, Alan, just on that, when people have talked
Yeah.
about authenticity and in the comments, but I see a lot of people who talk about, particularly in the legal industry, it's sometimes where law firms, it's very hard to define a purpose where people believe in it, right? We know in-house can join organizations where they feel connected to that organizational purpose. And in many respects, you have a choice when you go to a corporate to say, does that align with my values, my approach to how I want to work? Is that an organization I want to be proud to work at? But we've got to be really careful, I think, with authenticity because it's so easily lost. And particularly if you have, I was just looking at some purposes as part of this. You look at Patagonia, that's probably made the biggest impact when it comes to purpose. And their purpose of we're in business to save our home planet. They've made it and made it work, even though you'd look at a clothing brand and say, how do you do that? Whereas there are others that you might look at, and I know that people on this call will have purposes in their organization that they roll their eyes at. And somehow it's the leader's role to bring that to life for those people, not necessarily for the individual employees to try and find their own retrofit into that purpose.
Yeah, quite right, quite right. And in fact, having clarity around what you stand for is an essential ingredient of that consistency that people pointed to as being a characteristic of effective leadership, right?
Yeah.
You need to know who you are and what you stand for, and consistency will follow. If you were not clear on that, inconsistency will follow, and you saw the damage that does. It seems to me that we should actually then look a little more closely at this question of sort of leadership and what makes it effective. I'm going to ask that we sort of click to the next slide, and I'm going to propose this for our discussion today. Consider this about leadership. Leadership, given the conversation we just had, implies followership. And followership, I'm going to suggest, has two ingredients to it: that there's a desirable result or an outcome, promise that will be kept, a direction towards something that somehow is better, plus an inclination to follow. If you don't have followership, you aren't leading much. And followership needs to come for a reason. And I'm going to suggest that that's sort of the underlying chemistry. Well, if that's the case, if we go to the next slide, logically, the next piece would be, there we go. If you're going to lead, you have to have a destination or a result to offer. You have to be for something. And there was this question of connecting, and that showed up in people's comments around best and worst. Connecting and engaging is important. So therefore, to lead effectively, clarity on your purpose and the promises that you intend to have kept, and the ability to connect, understand your people, and influence them to follow. And I'm using this in the broadest sense, of course, with respect to teams, but in a general counsel or a legal services group, you have stakeholders where, in fact, you need them, you need to lead them in the sense that you need to help them be better. And you have stakeholders in the sense of those to whom you report, CEO and so forth. And if you're in public practice, your clients, connecting and leading them toward what you promised is actually important. It's all the same stuff. And so if that's the case, I'd like to look a little bit at sort of this question of influencing. But before I do that, I'm just going to pause, Dan. Any comments before we sort of launch into this question of influence?
I think it's one of the essential characteristics of great leaders. We talk at O-Shaped in our attributes, and there's a series of attributes, one of which is trust and influence, right? And this ability to influence people in a way that keeps them very much on side, right? And that's one of the skills I've seen of the leaders I've worked with, is their ability to bring you along with them. And that means they're influencing your thinking in a way that you feel actually connected to and part of the outcome and solution. That for me is great leadership, because it might be that I need to be persuaded to go along, but if I can see the clear picture of where we're going and that leader's taking me with me, that's for me is a great sign that you're working with, or I'm working with someone that I trust as a really effective leader.
Okay. Well, then let's look a little more closely at this question of connecting and influencing. So there's our title slide. Let me start the investigation. We go to the next one, you'll see a couple of propositions. So we talked about engaging, and people talked about engaging with their people. And I'm going to suggest something that you could call the platinum rule. So many of us learned early in our lives something called the golden rule, which is treat others as you would like to be treated. I'm going to suggest that if you are going to connect with people and inspire them to follow you, you need to treat them as they would like to be treated. And that goes to this whole question of engagement and understanding. And these were words that showed up in people's chat earlier. And if that's the case, if we go to the next sort of proposition here, if you're going to connect effectively, I think we need to remember a couple of things. First is that the rest of the world does not think exactly as you do. And anyone who's been in a relationship will know that there are times where the person you're in the relationship with doesn't see it the way you do. This is life. And it therefore follows that if you have insight into others' preferences and dislikes, you're in a stronger position to understand how to connect with them most effectively and to understand what would incent them or lead them to follow the direction that you're setting. And to do that, I'm going to take a quick sort of 2 or 3 minutes and we'll look at a model which is out there, which I have found very helpful for this. So if we go on to that, um, so this is a Deloitte product. It is in the public domain, and you'll see in a moment there's a book that you can get, but there's also, they have a website where there's all kinds of resources. But here's how it works, and the principles we'll draw from it. So if we go to the next slide, the background to this is if you are going to lead someone, you need to understand the way you see the world, and you need to understand how they see the world, so that you will understand where you are naturally going to get it right and where you need to think a little bit if you are to connect effectively. Now, Deloitte years ago did a whole lot of research around what led people to have productive or less productive relationships. And what they uncovered, if you do a quick click, you'll see they uncovered that there were preferences that clustered together. And when they sort of examined these preferences, they noted that some of them are close to other preferences and some of them actually are diametrically opposite. And if you think about it, the message here is one person's preferences can be another person's annoyances. Someone who likes short and sweet and isn't afraid of quick argument and quick decision will be very, very annoying to someone who likes a lot of discussion and debate and really wants to hear what everyone thinks. Conversely, someone who's all about moving quickly and taking risks and trying new ideas, this will be troublesome to someone who really wants to understand the data and is more conscious of risk. That's life. Deloitte, in its way, they gave them labels which sort of indicate what you look for when you look at these preferences. And if you do the next couple of clicks, I summarized these. They would call pioneers. These are people who are drawn to ideas and possibilities. They love to think of new things. They are great at ideation. Down a little farther, on the other side of that, you'll see guardians. They called them, these are people who value data and structure and stability, very important to them. A group they call drivers, these are about challenge and action. They really want to keep things moving. They like to win. They are drawn to data, and they're not going to worry as much around how people are feeling. And of course, opposite to that, a group they call integrators. These are people who value connections and people. It's very important to them to connect with others. It's very important for them to understand the context and make sure everyone understands what's going on. They will favor a lot of conversation. And of course, sometimes on the other side of that, drivers don't. So, the other thing to remember, of course, is that nobody's exactly one thing. If you do another click, we would remember that sometimes these things are kind of nuanced, and sometimes you have to look and sometimes you don't. But the point is this: by looking at and understanding your stakeholders and considering what they like, what you see that they respond to and what they don't, you can find a way and you'll be in a stronger position to understand how they see the world and therefore understand what they will respond to fastest. It makes it a much more efficient use of your attention and energy when you do come to engage with them. Some people, you send your stuff in advance knowing they're going to read it. Other people, you don't distract them with that because you know they're not going to read it. They want to walk through it in the moment. That's not good. That's not bad. It's them. And the question is, understanding what makes sense to you, understanding what makes sense to them, and playing to that, treating them as they would like to be treated, you are going to have greater influence. So I'm going to go on to the next sort of slide, because then this is, of course, important to disclose. If you want to know more about this stuff, now's a good time to do a screenshot. There is publicly available resources that Deloitte has out there. There's a book that you can order. And it sort of goes deep into this stuff. But the point is this: understanding how others see the world and playing to that, meeting them on those terms. People talked about empathy in their preferences or in their experience of good leadership. This is the stuff of empathy. It's not sympathy, it's empathy. Understanding how others see the world and like to be treated. That's the essence of it. So then once you've leveraged that connection, you are in a better position to get them to disclose what they consider important, which is another essential ingredient in influencing. Dan, I wonder, we could probably pause here and just remind people if there's a question or a comment you want to put in the chat, we are watching it. But what are your reflections on sort of that whole question of empathy and understanding how others see the world?
So many people, I think, particularly in house, but many people will have gone through some type of psychometric, similar, where they'll look at and understand preferences and types and how you interact with each other. The key thing with all of these things, and I like what you've described, is putting it into action and using it. So some of the work, so O-Shaped and Denton's work very closely together in partnership. And one of the elements of that is that we use a tool very similar called Type Coach, which brings out very similar outputs in terms of people's preference. And empathy clearly is a key part of understanding what others default to and how you can perhaps overcome and bridge differences in typical and type and preferences. Now, what's really interesting for me with these things is how you put them into action. So many people will go away with their letters, their preferred letters, and they'll put their badge up on the wall with their different colors or their letters from Insights, whatever it is, and never really think about how to apply that in their actual day-to-day role. And for many of you on the call, I really urge you to look back at a psychometric you may have done, whether it's the Deloitte one, whether it's Type Coach, whether it's Insights, whatever it may be, and say, how does that affect my relationships day-to-day with my team? And how does it impact on how we're dealing with stakeholders in the organization? Because whilst it's a preference, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not learnable to work differently with others. And that's the key for me between preference and actually how can we use our skills, understanding, empathy to move into space that others occupy and help to bridge those gaps. So that's the other thing I just mentioned. I think it's all bang on. How do we use it day to day is the key for me, Alan.
Okay. All right, well then I think we're going to make it a little more practical then, putting it into action. We should probably look a little more closely then to lawyers as leaders and how that plays out in the profession, and in particular where you have general counsel groups who need to work with other stakeholders. Dan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I've always felt that lawyers and leadership terms next to each other is a bit of a tension creator. And I think they've had an uncomfortable relationship in my experience. And there's some things on the next slide that you'll see in perhaps my kind of reflections on this. I've always felt, and really O-Shaped is born out in many respects from the way in which lawyers have traditionally been trained and developed through the system, where leadership skills and other attributes that go towards people and business skills are considered secondary to the development of core substantive legal knowledge. And what that means is that they're treated as like soft skills, right? And I've always hated that term soft skills because it somehow places them at a secondary level of importance. And the reality is that if we are agreed, as I hope we are, and most people on this call will recognize, that leadership is about behaviors and not hierarchies, there is no reason why we can't start learning leadership behaviors and traits from day one. So when people come through our universities, when they come through the law schools, that they start to recognize that these skills and capabilities are part of the day job of being an effective lawyer, not seen as an add-on. And when people get to positions that they find themselves in as leading, they go, oh, well, actually, we better learn something about this whole leadership thing. So what I see in the legal profession genuinely is a leadership crisis where we have people promoted to leadership positions, particularly at law firms, but not exclusively, where it's about achieving the partnership status, which in itself is a leadership position, without the training, or often without even wanting to lead people, which is even worse. I want to be a partner because I love doing the law and I'm good at billing. But frankly, this whole managing stroke leading people is not for me. Someone else can deal with that. That for me is potentially corrosive. It will lead to lots of the characteristics and traits that people described in question 2 earlier on. But the flip side is what a great opportunity for people who genuinely recognize the importance and can lead people through their organizations to be, I hope, challenging many of the things that the legal profession is dealing with around burnout, well-being, DEI, ESG, all things that require a holistic leadership approach. Now, O-Shape spent a huge amount of time working cross-industry to try to highlight the importance of these skills and capabilities, to recognize, back to the Marriott quote, that if we give people these skills, they will be able to bring that brilliancy to all of their clients and customers, who will love the fact that they're dealing with people who demonstrate these behaviors. And so if we can somehow bring human skills, the kind of skills we've been talking about, to a level playing field, at least with the technical skills, I think what we'll see is the transformation of lawyers into great leaders, and then great leaders that can start to position their in-house teams in particular, but also in private practice, can position the legal function and lawyers as those that can lead industry and not just simply be much more focused on what they are doing themselves. And even finally, really, what they are doing just for their teams. What I've been imploring for general counsel to do is to take much more of an industry leadership role, to say that, yes, we can lead a team, and yes, we can have a role in our own business. But frankly, the legal industry in many respects is broken. And the buyers of service, those that lead the teams that buy services, could have a massive impact on the industry more broadly. That, for me, is a real opportunity that we should be exploring. Alan, I don't know where you sit with all that, but you can tell it's an area of passion of mine.
Well, I mean, it's certainly clear, and you've been very articulate and very focused in your comments. So I certainly agree with all of it. But now a couple of the folks on the call have raised an interesting dimension to this, and it's an ethical dimension. So I've been watching the chat now. Nicole has a good point here. And her comment is that she finds the empathic approach difficult when stakeholders are in different quadrants. And it does happen. To our earlier point, Nicole, not everyone sees the world as you do. So how do you balance that? I'd like to turn to that question, but I'd really like to start with the question below it, where Indu has said it's rather a Machiavellian approach. Does Donald Trump use these skills very effectively? Well, Machiavelli, yes. The skills are the skills. And when they are abused, they lead to really unhappy outcomes. So if you look to leaders whom we would never want to see on the stage again, and I'm not going to point to Trump, but I will point to ones in the past century who sort of got us into some really unhappy wars. There's no doubt that they were effective leaders. They had huge followership and tremendous support. But the focus, the purpose they had, and the focus they had was actually not about the well-being of anyone, but really themselves. And I'm going to suggest, and we're going to talk a bit about this question of trust in a moment, but I'm going to suggest that when it is about your followers and about your stakeholders' interests, honestly so, that it doesn't become Machiavellian, it becomes in service to someone. But if it's about power for power's sake, and it's about feeding your own ego, which people pointed to in our earlier question around what's the worst you've ever seen, then it becomes problematic. So there is an ethics piece here as well. And that, I think, goes back into the purpose comments that Dan shared earlier. But also it goes to your own focus as a leader and what you're about. And so where I'm going with this one, Indu, is it can be Machiavellian if it's about something that is other than the well-being of your followers. And so we'll talk a little bit around how that works in a moment. Now, I do want to go back and talk just briefly to the question Nicole raised, and a quick story. So if you think carefully and curiously and not with judgment, right, around someone whose style is different than yours, what I'm suggesting is there are ways you can approach them that feed that better. So an example, I had a colleague who was trying to build a relationship with a senior executive in one of the banks. And he was in an advisory role, so akin to a lawyer's role, wanted to develop a more productive relationship, more business. And he would go once a month and visit his executive client, and he would go in with just 3 points on a piece of paper: what's going on in the industry, what I would see in the bank, what are the opinions and the information I have to share. And he would sit and talk for an hour about each of the 3 points. And the executive would smile and say, "Thank you very much. I'm glad you came to see me." Shake hands, leave, and nothing. No further phone call, no further consultation, no further discussion. He thought a little bit around the style that he saw, and he noticed that his client was very reserved paid close attention to detail, and really valued structure. And so he changed his approach. The things he was going to say, he put into a small table, 6 or 7 cells with the point he would raise and 2 or 3 points underneath, and he sent it in advance. And when he got there for the discussion, the guy pulled out the paper, looked at it, and said, "This is what I want to talk about." And he had written notes all over it, and they went through each one, spent the hour. The client did most of the talking. At the end, the client said, "This is one of the most useful discussions I've had in a long time. I would like to talk to you more about some stuff I'm thinking about." So the way empathy worked there, it was understanding that this person's preference was to get data in advance and be given an opportunity to reflect on it. He didn't really appreciate being walked through it in the moment. He couldn't keep up. It's just the way he thought. And so think about what their preferences are. Would they rather hear it in the moment? Would they rather hear it in advance? Do they want it? Do they want it up front, or do they want the context? That will give you a clue. That's how empathy works, and they will respond more. So I hope that answered your question, Nicole, but it does play into our next one around what people prefer. And I'd like to then move on. We're getting another question. Hierarchy structure reinforces skills leadership versus human leadership. It does, to username tree17. Organizations can, in fact, push you toward it being all about the work and the knowledge and not the human leadership. The trick is to go beyond it. And that's, I'd really like to turn to the trust equation, Dan, if we can do that. But before I do that, did you any comments around those 2 or 3 questions that came in?
No, I think, look, the way you've dealt with them, absolutely spot on. I would have said something very similar, but perhaps not as articulately. So thank you, Alan. And I think it's worth moving into this next bit.
Okay. So this does pick up on, how you connect with people most effectively. So, empathy, the business chemistry, or the other, insights that Dan talked about, give us a way to connect more effectively. Once you've made that connection, you need to get them to follow you. You need to take them in a direction that they will find useful. The second part of leadership and building followership. This is a model that's been around for about 20 years. It was developed by Trusted Advisor. It was originally created in the consulting world, but it does fit for any advisory, or in fact, any relationship. And it's the essence of trust. So you can see it's basically a mathematical formula. T equals C plus R plus I, all divided by S. And you can see the labels of the variables. Trust is a function of credibility, reliability, and intimacy, all divided by self-orientation. Now, credibility simply means, do you know what you're talking about? Reliability means, do you do what you say you're going to do? Intimacy means, do you make it your business to find out what the other person really cares about, what's important to them, what makes them uneasy, and what they are trying to accomplish? And do you protect that information with the care and consideration with which it was given? Because they had to be a little bit vulnerable to share it with you. And self-orientation means, to what extent is everything you are doing actually about you? Are you trying to sell something? Are you trying to make yourself sound smart so that you convince everyone that you're relevant? Are you dominating the room because you are in fact afraid of challenge? Look at what your own view is, and this goes into your earlier question around the Machiavellian thing. If it's about you, the rules of mathematics will say, remember how the denominator works. It immediately discounts and reduces the value of the expression, which means trust goes through the floor when it's about you rather than about your stakeholder. But when it is less about you and more about that intimacy, what do they really care about? And how can you serve that? Their inclination to follow the direction you want to send will rise exponentially, and you will have a more productive relationship. So this question of trust, it showed up in your comments earlier in our call around what the best was, and implicit in all of the words around the worst you've ever seen. If you can't trust them, right? They're inconsistent. They flip-flop. I don't know what's right and what's wrong from one day to the other. They don't have my back. This is the essence of trust in a professional and business relationship. Hey, Dan, what are your thoughts on sort of how this works? I know you use this in your work. You've seen it play out, and just what are your further comments?
Just to focus on the S for a minute, because as you said, the denominator it has the biggest impact, and you will all know of people that you have worked with, and you could go into any team and ask for the person who is very S, right? who is very much focused on themselves. And I bet everyone would point to the same person in the team. If you have someone in a leadership position who is very self-oriented, which would therefore score very highly on this, which is not where you want to be on the denominator, it's very hard to build any trust in the first place, let alone erode it, because people can spot a mile off. He says, ignoring the Trump comment for a minute, people can spot a mile off when people are just in it for themselves. And that requires an element of self-awareness from a leader to recognize that they need to dial down on what their ultimate motives are. And I hope in some respects, the best leaders don't even come in with any ulterior motive. It's simply about, how do I ensure that I am setting this team up for success? Now, I've worked with the trust equation with how you build stakeholder relationships, and how the intimacy in particular is one the professions and legal profession has struggled with building rapport, the chemistry that you've talked about. But for me, and here for this current purpose, building that connectivity means really leaving your own self-motive at the door and starting to think about the role and responsibility you have in ensuring the people you lead and the stakeholders you are building relationships with, that what they care about matters most.
Yeah, and the thing I like about this is it goes both to individual professional and business relationships, and it goes to institutional or organizational. And what I mean by that is that intimacy piece. One of the things I often hear around legal services groups or general counsel groups is that they're obstructive, right? Everybody gets great ideas in the organization, and their job, unfortunately, is to say, no, the risks are such and such, and you can't proceed. And I was doing work some years ago with a major bank and their general counsel group, and they were at loggerheads, particularly with the marketing people. So the marketing people would come up with fabulous new products and fabulous campaigns, and to build the bank and expand its product offering and so forth. And they were always in a fight, because they would come and finally the legal services group would come back with 17 risks that they hadn't thought about that were going to scuttle the whole thing, and they were the stoppers. And we talked about this model, and they made a change. And the change that they made was they started going regularly to their counterparts in this marketing group and simply saying, what are you working on? What are you trying to accomplish? What are your plans this year? What do you have in the pipeline? How will that work? What are you hoping for it? Questions like this that go to that intimacy. Tell me what's important to you. And when they started doing that, and it was less about protecting the bank and making my department have value, and became about, how can I help you go where you're going and still keep my promise to the bank, which is we keep ourselves from legal risk. All of a sudden things got better, because they started to find out more and more, earlier and earlier, what was in the pipeline, and they were in a position to say, if you want to do that, you need to worry about these 3 legal risks, and here is how we make sure that we don't get in trouble. And stuff started to move faster. They had a much more productive relationship, and in fact they got more done. And so this plays out that way. In an individual leadership role where you are worrying about a team, you practice this with the individuals, and it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I know what I'm talking about as a leader. I do what I say I'm going to do, all that consistency that people talked about earlier. But I want to know individually, what's important to you. What are you hoping to achieve? What do you want to learn? How do you want to grow? How satisfied are you? When you have a conversation, you make it about them. You all of a sudden understand better the context within which they will be inclined to follow you or not, and you're in a stronger position. In legal terms, all that's happening here is you are gathering evidence, and it is a form of discovery, because in the leadership world, there's an argument. You are on trial for the for the quality of your direction, and people are bringing their own arguments, and all you're doing when you practice that intimacy is you are understanding the evidence that they are looking at when they bring their argument around, will I follow or not. It is nothing more than that. If you go in and you find you're making assumptions, it's like going into court and not having read the other side's brief and understand the evidence that they are thinking about leading in support of their own argument. It's the same kind of thing. discovery is important in leadership. And the final sort of point to think about in this model is the juxtaposition between judging and curiosity. If you are being curious, you are by definition not being judging. And if you're being curious in the right way, you are going to put yourself in a stronger position to lead. If you find yourself judging, it means you are not being curious, which means you're going to miss something, and the intimacy will be lower, and you will be not as effective. And so I'll pause there. Dan, your further reflections on this, and again, take it back perhaps to lawyers as leaders.
Well, yeah, and I wonder whether or not it's a good opportunity, Alan, to just pick up the question that's just been asked, and also to move on just to look at the leading the in-house function, because what you're describing is very common before in terms of, and not to forget, there you go, you've mentioned the book, and I think it's important we recognise that's Maister and others' work. But you know, we look at the leading the function. I've said there, and the question is about how do you push your vision forward without seemingly being in a much more S position, i.e., it's all about you pushing out your vision. Well, the next slide, what I've said is, I've made the obviously hilarious quip about there being 3 strengths and characteristics of leading an in-house function, and it being about vision, vision, and vision. If I'd have just put 2, I could have had double vision, I realised. But let's assume it's double vision plus 1. For me, about setting that direction is critical, right? And this is how I'll come on, I hope, to dealing with that question that's come in. When I came in and led a team, we had brilliant lawyers doing brilliant stuff, but none of them really knew where they were going. So they effectively just turned up at work, did a good job, went home. And so there's no real sense of direction. And many talked about just not really having a kind of a pilot or a captain to steer their ship, however you do it. So I set about very quickly having a vision. If it wasn't perfectly crafted, it wasn't beautifully done, but at least it was a direction as to what I felt and what we as a team felt we should be doing, and ultimately me as a leader wanting to sell that vision into the team. Now, what that meant was, of course, we had to go out to the organization and sell that vision to others in the organization. And the challenge there, I think, is, well, that's all about you, right? And I would push back and say that's all about you. I think in response to that question, what's your motive for doing that? When you think about the S, think about motive. And in our case, the motive was about being able to create the most fabulous legal function that would enable the business to achieve its objectives. So whilst on the face of it, it might have been, look at me, look at me, look at me. I say it 3 times because of the vision. That look how amazing my function is. It's not about that. It's about saying, we want to get to know you, stakeholders, really well. Because if we do this, and if we tell you how amazing we are, you're going to be able to get the best out of us to enable us to achieve the business's purpose, objective, and values and vision and everything else. So I don't believe that going out there selling your soul to the rest of the organization about how great you are is about you. I think actually your motive, provided it is in how I think the question's asked, your motive is ultimately designed to enable the business to achieve its objectives. And a business needs a really strong legal function to do that. So that, I suppose, helps me move into a segue to overcoming some of this negative perception. I'm really interested if people on the call have experienced something like this. And if you have, please throw it in the chat. But back in 2018, we had a new CEO come into Network Rail, where I was a general counsel, the UK rail infrastructure manager. And I was introduced to the new CEO by another director that said, don't worry, new CEO, you'll like Dan. He's not like normal lawyers. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Is that a compliment? Is that an assumption that the CEO won't like lawyers? And it turns out it was the latter. And the CEO's perception was one that you would be slowing us down, that you'd be blocking. And frankly, you'd want to put so many risks in front of us, we'd never achieve anything. And I didn't think our team was like that. Certainly I wasn't. And so it took a long time for me and others in the team to influence the CEO so we could overcome that negative perception and start to demonstrate as a function we could lead change through the organization, not just simply advise and point out all the things that would go wrong. Now, in order to get there, we had to create, and this is for me the challenging part, we had to create an environment in the team where people felt safe enough to share. And this is this idea of psychological safety people may be familiar with, that came from some of the research, well, originally back in the 50s, but most recently shared by Amy Edmondson at Harvard in her seminal work, really, where she's looked at what high-performing teams all share in terms of their attributes, and she talked about the ability for people to speak up without fear of retribution or blame in what she described as psychological safety. And that enables team members to all contribute to a better overall outcome for the team, and therefore, as a legal function, being able to identify where that function could add most value across the organization. Too much of the profession, both whether you look at from law school all the way through to leadership, operates on the basis of fear of making a mistake, fear of looking silly, fear of colleagues perhaps now blaming you for something. And we've got to start pulling, and the leader's role for me is being able to give people that assurance that, frankly, we should be operating in a space where people can be creative and innovative, and fear really is the opposite of that. And so I think that one of the, I hope, successes that we had was being able largely to bring people into the space where we were much more about being creative, being in an environment where people felt they could contribute, and bringing that diversity of perspectives to the table. That for me was what I saw as being my role as a leader. But that meant we had to convince both our own people that this was the direction of travel. It wasn't all about the law. And also that we would then overcome this negative perception. We'd educate the business. Now, in some respects, I go back to the question on motive. Our motive was for a better outcome for the business, not to get our own flags and scarves with our names on it going, look how amazing we are. And I'm really interested in whether others have experienced something similar. And also, to get there, Alan, we had to invest time and effort in developing skills, developing people's capabilities, where everyone is going, we're too busy, we're too busy, we're too busy. I always find it interesting when you ask a lawyer, how are you? The number one response is, I'm really busy. Right? Number one response, pretty much universally. Go and ask anyone now when you see a lawyer that's not in your team directly, go and ask them how they are. I guarantee you the first one, if not the second one, will say, I'm busy, really busy, as if that's a sign of importance. So how do we get past that to the point where we can start to now recognize that where do people get these skills from, right? And this is what I'm really interested to know from people on the call. If you recognize this is important, if you see that developing these capabilities will help you, will help your team, will help ultimately your business go forward, well, where do you get the skills? Because frankly, in my opinion, they are still regarded as a nice to have and a luxury, as opposed to being an absolutely core, necessary part of your day job. Hopefully that gives people time to chime in. I don't know, Alan, whether people have or what your reflection is on that.
Well, we have a couple of questions in. I do want to make sure we turn to them, but it strikes me that what you're pointing to is it goes to this question of relevance, which goes back to the earlier question. It's around this sort of self-focused part in the trust equation. And the question was asked earlier, to what extent is this actually just Machiavellian or self-serving? And in fact, to your point, where it is in service to something that matters, so to advancing your organization's business strategies or goals or your stakeholders' individual agendas, then you have created the context, which goes to, I think, Stepan, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, has asked a question. How do you balance out or make a visible difference between driving your vision of doing things and not being a high-scoring S, it being all about you? Well, Stepan, if you think about it in this context, actually, here's the best way I can think of to answer this question. And it comes from a guy I worked with for many years. He was a former CEO in one of the large oil corporations, and he would have this great line. He'd say, "The language of leadership is 4 words: I want, we need." And he said, but you need all 4. I want, you do have to make requests as a leader for people to move, but we need, that's equally important, because that tells them how they will win. And so when the move you are making as a leader is essentially to advise people, this is what winning will look like, and here is how we will win. If you are taking your group toward what they believe is going to be a win, then they will follow you. And that is not about yourself. That all of a sudden becomes about them. And so just picking up on Dan's reflections earlier, I've heard it said, no team can be stronger than its leader. So Dan, to your question, where do these skills come from? I think it starts with those who would lead teams and think about the moves they are making to incite and invite deeper followership and to move from telling people what to do to helping them understand how to think and to understand what would motivate them, how to influence them to do so. All of a sudden, when you see your leader doing that and you see that it's working, then that's how you learn. Otherwise, people, it becomes a concept. They have to see it in practice. And I just love this comment that came in from Eileen. It's actually a quote, Eileen, from Maya Angelou, the poet. People will remember you because of how you made them feel, not what you said or what you did, but how you made them feel. Now, there's a couple of other questions in around recording. Yes, it's going to be done. And I didn't see any other questions. So I think we're at the point where I'm just going to check the time. I think now, Nev, that we have to do some housekeeping. But before I pause, Dan, any last thoughts or comments before Nev takes us through to the top of the hour?
Yeah, look, I suppose as my final reflection on all of this is that people started out by sharing some of the characteristics of really strong leaders and the characteristics of the worst leaders. So people know, right? We know the characteristics that make good, effective leaders. The question then is, how do we make that part of our everyday experience? And if you are leading, how you turn those words into action. And so I would suggest that people reflect on them and think, how do I make those the reality? Because we all know what good looks like here. And frankly, we all know what toxicity in leadership looks like too. And we all know the impact that micromanagement has on our own interest, purpose, value, and meaning at work. And we shouldn't, frankly, nowadays have to stand for leadership that is synonymous with the poor qualities that were described in that second question. So I would urge people, wherever they are, whoever they're leading or whoever they're led by, to try to bring about the kind of terminology that you described in that first question. It's not easy, it needs practice, and in some respects, it will never work because there are leaders out there that frankly just simply do not get it. And that means, and I've experienced myself, that sometimes you need to make that sideways move in order to go upwards to ultimately lead people, if that's the desire that you have, because leaders can be blockers too if they are ineffective. And identifying that early, if you have an ambition to lead people and lead teams, frankly, I think it's important to do it and do it early. The final thing is that wherever you are, whatever your role you're in, I go back to it being about behaviors, not hierarchy, and that we should be adopting those behaviors wherever we can, even if it feels like others aren't noticing. To me, it's all about when you do this when no one is watching is when it will ultimately count. So I think that's probably my final soapbox moment, if that's all right, Alan and Neve. I'm sure you'll want to have a final. Alan, you might want a final word, then Neve to close off.
Well, I can't add much more to what you've said. You've been so clear with it, but perhaps I will add this. If you want to build followership, you have to make it about your followers. They want to be better, they want to win, and they want you to lead them toward the win. That means you need to be clear as to what a win will look like. You need to find out where they are starting from, how they think, so that you know how to approach them in a way that is empathic, right? That actually plays to their own preferences. When you do that, you will have sown the seeds and actually set the stage for quite effective leadership. But you got to make it about them. It's not about you. For that, I think Neve, we have to turn it back to you for sort of final comments and logistics and so forth.
Yes, so a huge thank you to so many of you for joining the call today. And I just want to say in particular, thank you for your honesty and for really getting stuck into the debate and the discussion, which made it so much more richer. I also want to say a huge thank you, obviously, to Dan and Alan for the time, thought, and consideration they put into today. Feel free to connect with them. If you want to drop us a note, equally, we'll connect you directly to them. So that's absolute, we'd love if we continue the discussion, maybe not here online, but outside of this online environment. That's what it's all about. Lots of great sessions on the roadmap over the next number of months. So we're looking forward to seeing you talking about lots of different things, from data privacy to risk to leading and managing change. So looking forward to continuing this conversation, albeit on slightly different themes over the next few sessions. That concludes today's session. Wishing you all a great rest of day wherever you are in the world. Thank you.